Hello again, everybody. How are we doing? We are going to be doing our end of the season awards finally. Hopefully, you guys can enjoy this on a nice little Sunday, enjoying your summer. It looks like it's been pretty hot over in
Yeah.
the UK and Ireland. So, hopefully, you guys are watching this in a nice, cool, temperate little zone for you to enjoy. But let's get into this. This is going to be our end of the season awards. Get into the comments below, as always, because there probably will be at some point you will disagree with what we've given. We've actually tried to be, a bit more controversial on some of these, because I think there are plenty of obvious choices. So we've tried to maybe think outside the box on a couple of them. Do smash the like button as well for us, please. You do help us out a ton. Let's get into it, Dave. The first one is player of the season. Now, I've gone with Brennan Johnson. I'm just going to get it off my chest right here, right now. I put it on TikTok. I put it on Instagram Reels. If you haven't seen it already, I have given Brennan Johnson my player of the season. And I'll be honest, it's been a pretty underwhelming season for the most part as a Tottenham Hotspur fan. So I don't think this was the most, let's say amazing, player of the season award. But I've given it to Brendan mostly because the way I look at the definition of player of the season, it is over the course of the whole season. It's not like a little stint in time where they were amazing and then they sort of faded away. I kind of want to look at it, across the whole campaign. And you could argue Brennan Johnson was the most consistent goal scorer across this entire season. He was the top goal scorer in the Europa League, I think tied with Dominic Solanke. He was the top goal scorer, of course, in the Premier League for us. He showed up big in the Europa League in some of those final matches against Bodo Glimt, worked really hard for the team, but also popped up with a goal. And then, of course, popped up with a goal in the final against Manchester United. And like I said, worked his tail off in those games as well, which is something that I gave him a lot of shit for, to be
Mm.
perfectly honest. It was something that really kind of grinded my gears with Brennan Johnson, that I felt like he just in a lot of games wasn't helping out Pedro Porro as a fullback and tracking back, working hard for the team. But in the most important games of our season, towards the tail end of the season, I would not accuse him of that. I thought he did actually work very, very hard. But like I said, it's been an extremely underwhelming season. So I don't think there really was a ton of amazing candidates for this. So I think I just had to go by the numbers. I had to be a stat nerd and give it to my man, Brendan. I would say this, though. There were plenty of games where at halftime, you and I were talking to each other. We were looking at the live chat. It wasn't just us, where I did say, has Brennan Johnson even touched the ball,
Yeah.
this game? Has he even done anything in this game? But I'm going to give it to him because by the numbers over the course of the whole season and in the biggest games of the season, this guy did show up for us. But like I said, I don't think this is my favorite ever player of the season award. It's not one that really jumps off the page for me.
Look, I'd argue it's probably the worst bunch of candidates ever for a player of the season award at Tottenham Hotspur in my lifetime. But to be fair, look, Brennan Johnson, I agree with you. He is actually player of the season, and fair play to him. He delivered the Europa League Cup as well, with that winner as well. So fair play to him. With me, I was also looking at the likes of Lucas Bergvall, Jack, but when we sort of narrowed it down, I was sort of the opinion that he's going to come a bit later on in the award ceremony. For me, the reason why I've actually put Kulusevski forward, Jack, is I think people actually really forget how much of a good campaign he's actually had this season, and I'm talking from the very beginning of preseason all the way through for a large part of the season. He was our best player. Only that injury he had sort of, took him out of the running to a
Yeah.
large degree. And don't get me wrong, his return wasn't great. It was a bit frustrating, but I would add, I think when he came back, he had a creativity, maybe just didn't, again, end product wasn't the best, but, he played 50 games this season out of a 60 game campaign. I think people think he's missed a lot more than what he actually has. I think 10 goals and 11 assists, playing in a new position, coming through the midfield. I think all in all, especially considering this guy was raw off last summer, people were considering cashing in on him if a bid came in. So for me, that's why I've sort of put him in there, just as a reminder to say, look, don't forget about Kulu. I think
Yeah.
if you actually take, because at the end of the day, Jack, we all sort of go off recency bias, the way the
Yeah.
campaign has ended. But if you actually take it from preseason all the way through for large parts of that campaign, he was our best player.
I would agree with the recency bias argument with Kulusevski for why he could be a candidate, because we're all living off of the last few games of the season.
Yeah.
We're living off the Europa League final. We're living off the semifinal. And Kulusevski wasn't at his best because he was just coming back from that injury, right? So we still have those games on our mind. But if you went further back, towards the beginning of the season as well as through the middle of the season, this guy, like you said, was easily probably our most consistent
And,
and one of our most reliable and best players,
and
right?
let's
So it's just the recency bias does play a huge part. Even with my selection of Brennan Johnson, that was part of the reason I gave it to him, was because he scored goals in the beginning of the campaign, the middle of the campaign. But for me, I wouldn't have given it to him for that. It was more for what he did at the end of the
yeah.
campaign
Yeah.
is what I kind of gave it to him. So the recency bias point is spot on.
No, look, I agree. At the end of the day, Brennan Johnson comes out with Player of the Season. I just want to remind people about Kulu because I
Yeah.
think he gets a bit of an unfair. He doesn't really get mentioned, a lot of the campaign. And I think one thing that's unfair about him, you go and look at his stats. He's played, I think he's only missed 6 games in the Premier League. He played nearly all the games in the Carabao Cup run. He played both FA Cup games as well, plus nearly all the Europa League campaign. This guy was barely rested until the
Yeah.
point where he actually broke down for a little period. Whereas other players were rested in the cups, were rested in stuff like this guy wasn't. He was consistent right throughout large parts of the campaign.
Yeah, just quickly as well on Lucas Bergvall, I think again, if you're looking at the definition for me of player of the season over the course of the whole campaign, that's why I just wouldn't give it to Bergvall. Like he wasn't our best player, throughout the entire season. He had some nice spells here and there and had some really good games here and there, but it's not like a guy that was carrying us through this season or anything like that with also anything with goal contributions either. I think Pop Matasar had something like 6 or 7 more goal contributions than he did. And Pop Matasar, we would say, had a pretty underwhelming season. So I think
Mm,
with Lucas Bergvall, I think plenty of us might be maybe confusing or just sort of blending signing of the season, most improved player of the season with player of the
mm,
season. Player of the season for me is a guy that delivered beginning, middle, and end, and delivered in the biggest games at the same
mm,
time. And I wouldn't really say that was Lucas Bergvall. Could you really say in the biggest games this guy delivered? I wouldn't
mm.
necessarily say so either.
I'd
So
also
that's my thing with Bergvall.
look. I think Bergvall comes a bit later on in the season in the
Yeah.
awards, like
Yeah, he will.
sign of the season, etc. I think there's more awards that are more appropriate to Lucas Bergvall's campaign. Look, it's worth mentioning. Porro could have been a contender, but for me, that right hand side was a large source of goals
Yeah.
conceded last season. So I think it's hard for me to put him in there. Bergvall, like you mentioned, had a great season, but there's other awards coming for him. So
Yeah.
that's how we've sort of stumbled across these two.
Well, we got into it. Bergvall, I think, obvious candidate for me signing in the season. Value for money, that goes, without
Yeah.
saying pretty much. Clearly a gem in the making, a future star of this midfield. And dare I say, after watching him this season, a guy coming from Djurgården, a league that you would say, like, not really built to make Premier League, ready-made players. You would think it would have taken him a lot longer than what it has done for him to really show his value and his ability. He only had maybe a little, he had a rocky, maybe a little first couple of games, when he first came in, but eventually he just sort of took control and showed that he can be, a future of this Tottenham midfield. And in my opinion, he almost looks like he has the attributes to be at some point, maybe later on when he's 28, 29, could
Mm,
be if he goes down this pathway, a future world class midfielder. So value for money, the talent on display. This guy looks like he's like a Real Madrid, Barcelona midfielder of the future. So I think this is one of the best, typical, cheap,
mm.
amazing gem, that thing that Spurs always do, those diamond in the roughs, type of signings that they usually make. Lucas Bergvall is just another example.
Do you know what it is with Bergvall, Jack? I liken it to a bit like the Luka Modric signing that we made
Yeah. Yeah.
from Dynamo Zagreb all them years ago. He comes in, people look at him, go, maybe not ready, going to take a bit of a time to adjust. Um, and stuff like that, and maybe have their doubts around it. But you actually look at the rise. I think it's going to be. I think it could be the same as Luka Modric if he continues on this trajectory. This guy come in from the Swedish second division, sort of took his time in the first few months to really adjust and climatize to competitive action. Because in preseason, the guy was absolutely standout. He was brilliant. But when the competitive action came around and the physicality came around, it took him time to adjust. And that game at Galatasaray, it really was men against boys. He was the worst player on the pitch. And for a young guy to be able to recover from that and kick on the way he did, you're not going to see anybody else across Europe have the rise this guy has had this season at
Absolutely.
Tottenham Hotspur. So for me, I think if he can continue on this trajectory, because I think there's similarities to Luka Modric's game. He can pick up the ball, he can spray a pass, he can run with the ball if needs be and play people in. He's got a good shot from outside the box. So for me, if I'm in Bergvall's camp, I'd say to him, study Modric's career very closely, his game and stuff like that. And I think there's very similar, great similarities there. I would also argue, look, I think I was toying with the idea of bringing in Dominic Solanke. I just think the fee is what sort of threw me off. And I think where you hit your nail on the head is value for money, which is not something we've really got out of the transfer market the last, few years since the Pochettino era. And I think this guy embodies, great signing. One that more or less came off the data model, flagged up there, got wind he was going to Barcelona, managed to convince him, and he hasn't looked back since. Absolutely brilliant campaign for Lucas.
Looks like a future 100 million pound midfielder, if you ask me.
For sure.
Most improved player of the season, I've gone for James Maddison. The reason being is James Maddison had, in my opinion, a far, far, far better season than he did the previous season. And I'm going to steal one of Dave's points, but with the most improved category, we kind of went by this, a guy that had been at the club in a previous season, not somebody that's brand new, to the club from this season. Nobody that's making a debut campaign we think should qualify as a most improved. And you look at Madison's numbers compared to last season, he played 600 more minutes last season. This season, he played 600 more minutes, but he actually contributed 9 more goals. So it shows that while he played more minutes, he still contributed a fair amount of goals, more than he did this last season. And when you look at in terms of goal contributions in all competitions, he's actually tied second with the entire squad. He's tied with the likes of Johnson, Son, Kulusevski, but he played 400 fewer minutes at least than compared to Son, Kulusevski, Johnson, and Solanke. So if he played 400 more minutes this season, I think Sonny was the closest to him on like 3,100 minutes this last season. If he was allowed to play 400 more minutes, James Maddison, you wonder if he would have finished the season as our best goal contributor to this campaign. And the other point I would make is that we talk a lot about, can, Maddison, get stuck in, is he really that sort of guy that can press? These type of questions. A lot of people are giving him that excuse, in my opinion, not this season, but the previous season. They were saying, oh, he's not that sort of player. Ange isn't using him in the right way. I think Maddison showed that he can improve as a player, that he can, in fact, work hard for the team, get stuck in. And some of those Europa League games, like I remember some of the challenges he was making, to sort of save us from getting, counterattacked or transitioned on in a dangerous way. This guy was really showing that he has that in him. And in fact, in my opinion, improved as a player in a ton of different ways. And I'll add lastly, I think he showed up in some of the bigger games too. When you look at the Europa League, this guy was carrying us through some of those games in terms of the creativity department. So James Maddison went from, I'll be honest, someone who I didn't necessarily love in this Tottenham Hotspur team to now all of a sudden becoming kind of one of my favorite players really in this team. So I think that just shows he's easily a candidate for most improved. But Dave, you've gone for the Jedi. Now, I like this. I like this selection.
Yeah, I'm going to get into why I picked the Jedi. I just want to sort of finish, add one or two things about James Maddison quickly. Look, I was also considering him for player of the season, but when you were speaking there about, he's played less minutes, I would argue some of that down to his own detriment. I would argue that I think Brighton game where we were 2-0 up at halftime, we ended up losing 3-2. And, you go back and look at some of the goals, Maddison pulled out a lot of challenges in some of them games. And I think that's where the disagreement with him and Postecoglou came about for a period of time. And that's why he found himself out in the team. Because, I'd make the argument. I think people made excuses for James Maddison. Oh, that's not his game. It's like, but it doesn't matter what manager you're going to play with. Out of possession, you need a guy that can do that. Dele Alli, out of possession, got stuck in for Tottenham Hotspur. I don't remember that guy flanking, shirking responsibilities in that regard. So I think it should be expected of every player out of possession that he should at least be competent in that department. And look, fair play to him. I think he's come back. He's shown that side to the game, and fair play to him. He's answering my questions. Look, the reason why I'm really hard on James Maddison, and I've said this before, so because I believe there's a real top player in there.
Yeah, there's a player in there. Yeah.
But it's about getting it out of the fucker and getting him to want to do it. Now, when it comes to Jedi Spence, the reason why I picked Spence, Jack, is because no one had him in their plans last season before preseason when they were doing content, speaking about Tottenham squad. Everyone had him, almost chalked off that he needs to be sold. However, your boys here done a video about the Spence redemption arc. We thought possibly, there could be one here. There could be an opening here. And he took his moments in preseason. Yes, it was made hard for him throughout the campaign, but he came in at the Coventry game, crucial moment, sort of kept Ange Postecoglou in the job, to be able to go on and win the Europa League, because he would have been sacked after that Coventry game if we went out. So stood up in that game. Maybe a little bit hard done by again after that, but didn't lose his head, kept his cool. And when his opportunities came around, took them again. I remember the
Yeah.
Southampton game. We were going through a tough period, came in against Southampton within the first 30 seconds, and you pointed this out in the watch along. Look at him, got the ball forward, nice on direct, and it ended up setting the tone for that game. We went and won that game, easy enough, and he was a huge part of it. And for large parts, he put in unbelievable. He was our best player on the pitch nearly every game. I think what really maybe where Spence needs to learn moving forward is the disappointment when Udogie came back, that he went straight in ahead of him. I think Jed Spence sort of dropped these levels, being overlooked by Thomas Tuchel for the England squad. I think maybe he doesn't take rejection the best, but I think this is where Thomas Frank could have a real gem on his hands. If he comes in and realizes Jed Spence just needs a bit of love and guidance, I think you'll unlock the key to Jed Spence's game.
Totally.
But for me, that's why I have him in there, just purely because he was so far away from it. Now he's a player that nobody wants to sell, and they're arguing, why is he not in the team? So I think that speaks volumes to the career the season he's had.
He's an obvious candidate, Jed Spence, especially because I don't know if there's much debate. I think he did have a better season than Destiny Udogie, actually. So I think that's, further evidence to itself, of him having, that most improved player award. Let's go for flop of the season now. I've gone for Radu Dragic. I think Dave probably would agree, with some of the points I'll make on this. He had more minutes in all competitions than Romero and Mickey Van de Ven, and he actually only started one less game than Christian Romero. So when people say, oh, he just needs his chance, he just needs a run of games, well, he got a run of games, and I don't think he was exceptional, really, during that run of games. Yeah. In fact, I can't really point to any period during that run where he played like a consistent amount of good quality performances, where he put in some real shifts, came out as one of our best players. I can't really think of many games at all this last season where he was, in fact, one of our best players during that run. In fact, I think you could make the case that Archie Gray, during periods of that, injury area or that injury part of the season, I think Archie Gray almost looked like a better center back than he did. With Radu Dragic, he was poor on the ball. There were certain games where he actually at one point looked like this guy did not know how to complete a pass at all, playing out from the back, if it wasn't a sideways or backwards pass, sketchy first touch, defensive errors as well. I remember he had that Eric Dyer thing where sometimes he just seemed to sort of let a ball go over the top of his head, thinking that someone else was going to deal with it, when in fact he's the tallest man in the back line, the guy that you would expect would be no nonsense about it and just clear it away. There are plenty of times he didn't. He stepped out from the back line, which then led to some easy balls and behind that led to goals. I just think Radu Dragic got a fair amount of minutes this season. And did he really take those opportunities? I don't think he did. And in fact, a lot of people were lining this guy up to be the Romero replacement, the guy that, can maybe compete with Romero, in the long run. And I think he showed that he can't, to be perfectly honest. In fact, I think Kevin Danzo shows to be a much, much better center back than the likes of Radu Dragic. And that's even maybe another point for Radu Dragic being flop of the season. I think Kevin Danzo is already ahead of him in the pecking order at the moment, but we'll see what Thomas Frank has to say about that. But yeah, Dave, I think he's my candidate flop of the season, Radu Dragic.
Yeah, Radu is a guy that we call over here in Ireland the shaper, a guy that dresses the part but doesn't actually deliver, too afraid to get his hair messed up and a scratch on his face and stuff like that.
That man done a lot.
Yeah. Look, it's always in pristine condition, but funny enough, his touch is lacking and stuff. I think he should be spending more time on that than his hair. Anyway, not going to get sucked into that. My flop of the season is Yves Bissouma, and I've got a strong case why. For me, he came into the season knowing his contract was up here in 2 years' time and that he would have to have a phenomenal season to get that renewed. So there should have been hunger there. He came in the season on balloons. That should have told everybody what we needed to know from Bissouma coming up this season. Not only that, I look at some of the big games where this guy really let us down and could have actually altered the season to a large degree. I'll go back to that Chelsea game. We're in the ascendancy. We're winning. We look cushy. He gives away a couple of sloppy opportunities to Chelsea. They gather a bit of momentum. And what does he go and do in a pivotal moment? Give them a penalty, ends up losing the game for us. You go back to that Carabao Cup second leg against Liverpool. It was him that started the unraveling. It was a simple 10-yard pass to Papa Massar. Gave it straight to Liverpool, straight up the other end, in the back of the net. I go to the North London derby away from home. Okay, we were outclassed for large parts, but we were still hanging in. He gives away the ball. What happens? Ends up in the back of our own net. And then after the Chelsea game, I remember him apologising, goes out against Rangers. And at the end of the day, it's what you would call a European derby. Two British clubs going head to head. Fans want to win it. probably saves his worst performance of the season for that game. And, you know, to your point, the fact that Bergvall was brought in and he's coming from the Swedish second division, is in the squad ahead of Yves Bissouma, just like Danzel coming in ahead of Radu Dragusin, speaks volume to the shit show that he's had this season. At the end of the day, there's no excuse for it. This is a guy that Postecoglou came in, put his arms around, cuddled to try and get the best out of him, knowing how harshly he was treated underneath Antonio Conte, and that's how he responds. For me, it's got to the point, get him out of this football club.
Yeah, Baluma. Let's go on to goal of the season now. I've gone for Damola Ajayi. Dave's gone for Mickey Van de Ven. I think Dave's is a big candidate for a lot of people. You know, that was just an incredible goal. So, Dave, you know, take it away on
Yeah,
Mickey
I'm going to
Van de
get mine
Ven's.
out of the way. I'm going to get mine out of the way because I actually like your pick, and it's one that maybe I don't think about enough, which is actually a great goal, but we'll get onto it. But with Mickey Van de Ven, my one is the one at Old Trafford against Man United. You know, I've never seen a guy pick up the ball on the edge of his own box and just blow by everybody up the pitch unchallenged. And not only that, you know, when it's come to players in years gone by, you know, about them being good on the ball, the likes of your Dyer, Davy Sanchez, there's almost been excuses made for them. They're a centre-half. What do you want them to do? Well, there's no longer them excuses. If you go out and buy the right players, they're actually out there. Van de Ven is embodiment of that because he gets into the box and he just calmly floats it across. There you are, Brennan Johnson. Let's add another number to one of your goal stats this season. You just arrive in and I'll do all the work for you. Absolutely unbelievable from Mickey Van de Ven. That so much so, I think even half of the world looked at that goal when that was scored and goes, "Oh, if they can keep this guy fit, they've got one hell of a player on their hands." So for me, that's goal of the season. I just look back on it, and I think anyone goes back and watches it, you'll go, "Holy shit!" It's like a freight train that can't be stopped.
I do think his stock definitely rose after that goal against Manchester United. That's for sure. It is Brennan Johnson that scored it, but we all know that it was Mickey Van de Ven's goal. I gone for Damola Ajayi just because I look at, you know, the goal itself. It's just a beautiful move. You know, he passes the ball back, then receives it again, and then just sort of like a light bulb, you know, sort of flash in his head or something like that. And he just decided, you know what? You know, I'm just going to take on, you know, this whole Elfsborg team. You know, he took past one, sort of got through like a sea of, you know, Elfsborg, you know, yellow jerseys, you know, and then played this beautiful, you know, sort of weighted pass into Scarlett. Granted, you know, the layoff by Scarlett was also just, you know, just sort of sublime.
Yeah.
But then the touch that he even takes afterwards, I remember during the watch along, you know, nearly collapsing, you know, and just enjoyment just off of the touch that he takes off of Scarlett's, you know, pass towards him. And then the finish, you know, just calmly just sort of put into the bottom corner. I just think it was an aesthetically beautiful goal and just sort of had everything for me, you know, had, you know, the players sort of taking the initiative, you know, putting almost, you know, the team on his back, you know, by taking on a ton of players, then playing a nice little layoff. Everybody loves, you know, a 1-2. Everybody loves a nice little layoff. And then just to take that extra touch, you know, that extra bit of composure just made it just a beautiful goal for me. And when you look back on that night in Elfsborg, it was a crucial win. We actually needed to win that game. If we didn't win that game, we would have had to play extra games in the Europa League. Maybe that campaign goes differently if we played those extra games in the Europa League. We would have had to, I think, played like a Galatasaray or something like that, if I remember correctly, or maybe even had to play AZ even sooner. So you look at that goal, you know, it was the second goal, I think, as well. You know, we got the first goal via Dane Scarlett, but the second one killed the game. Exactly right, Dave. So that's what makes a goal of the season for me, is that beautiful goal, but a crucial goal. It wasn't just, you know, a random amazing goal in the course of the season.
Just a quick couple of things on that. I think you're absolutely spot on, Jack. The timing of the goal. Elfsborg were still in that game. He killed them off with that goal. You know, and what I like about it is most of that game, we sort of struggled to, you know, get them passing moves going. A lot of the times we tried to go on the outside. He was obviously looking on the bench and goes, well, hang on, if I can get that ball punted in there, run off the striker, there's an opportunity. And he mixed it up. He actually showed what some of our experienced wingers should have been doing for large parts of that campaign. You know, and you said it right. He put the team on his back. He got that ball. He says, I'm going to take responsibility here into Dane Scarlett. But do you know what it is for me, Jack? It's the composure of the finish. for large earlier on in the season, if you remember, Odegaard got into similar positions, but got excited, snatched at them. Not
Yeah.
everyone has that composure,
Yeah.
Sometimes you have that rawness. He didn't. He had that composure, buried it in the bottom corner.
Good point.
Unbelievable goal from him. And I think that night in general was just a great indictment of the academy. Dane Scarlett came on. He scored the first goal, set up the second. Ajayi came on, scored his goal. And Mikey Moore also rounded it off with his goal as well. So that night in general was amazing. I'm actually glad you picked that Ajayi goal, because thinking back on it, it was a moment where he just goes, fuck this, I'll show you how to do it. I'll put the team on my back. You're spot on, Jack. A bit like Van de Ven's run as well, to be fair.
And let's finish off with best and worst moments of the season. It's obvious the best moment was the Europa League. I don't think it could be anything else, apart from that for people. So we decided to maybe spend the time on, maybe worst moments of the season. And that's almost because, maybe we've forgotten about some of these worst moments of the season, because winning that Europa League final kind of makes up for it. I think it kind of, makes speaking about these worst moments of the season nowhere near as torturous. But Dave, take it away. Your worst moments of the season.
I'm actually looking at yours and mine. I think they're actually for the same reasons, but is concerning for like different reasons. It's actually mad. But anyway, when it comes to Arsenal and Liverpool, for me, the 2-1 away to Arsenal, for large parts of that game, we could not compete. We had a little goal near the end of the game, but we were absolutely outclassed that day. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, well, they're never going to win anything under Mikel Arteta. And if that's the standard, then how far we are off, it's concerning. But also, I look at that Liverpool game away in the Carabao Cup.
Yeah, second leg.
I'll be honest, after about 70 minutes, I felt like turning it off, because it got to the point where we were chasing a ball down. Liverpool just pop it around to the next guy. You chase that, pop it on to the next guy. And they just didn't lose possession. And I know they were champions last year, but it really sort of highlighted the level we really need to drag this squad to. Them 2 games really highlighted the level that we really actually need to drag this squad to if we want to compete. Sitting here pretending we can compete off a data-led model, trying to sign players that are undervalued in the market trying to improve them as we go. It's a fairy tale that's not going to work or not going to happen. And it was a real realization to me, unless you bring in ready-to-make-go quality players. Last season, in fact, as bad as it says, the only improvement that you can ever make on that as a Tottenham fan, unless they adopt their model in the transfer window, is finishing 10th and winning a trophy. It's the only way it's going to get better here. So for me, it was a real bad indictment of outclassed men against boys and how far we've fallen off.
Totally. For me, I went for Ipswich Town and Leicester City. I think those are probably plenty of people's worst moments of the season. The reason I've gone for Ipswich Town first is I think losing 2-0 at home at halftime is almost sackable in itself, really. Ipswich Town they might have been the best of the 3 teams that got relegated, but let's be honest, they were really nothing special, really, in my opinion. Like losing 2-0 at home and really getting outplayed too. I remember in that first half against Ipswich Town, and I don't remember us making that much of an effort to come back in the game. I know we eventually, I think, lost the game 2-1, but I think they deserved the win at the end of the day. So that was just an awful, awful loss. And this was before Spurs were kind of giving up on the league. Like we were still, I think, in November period at this point. So we were still trying to, push back in the Premier League at that point. And losing to them at home was just, it was sackable in itself. Yeah.
If I remember correctly, didn't you say we bet Villa and Man City either side of that as well? Which,
it's just,
you're right. Like it's a new low.
Yeah, it also just then just sort of made you question, when is this team going to ever go on, this sort of win streak that was needed? And, losing at home in a game like that really just, throws it out the door. Then in the Leicester City case, a bit different. We went 1-0 up, only then to lose 2-1 at home to Leicester City. And it was also, I think, Leicester City's like first win away from home, like all season or something like that. It was one of their only wins all season, if I remember as well, except for maybe a couple they got towards the end of the campaign. So you could say that we lost to as well one of the worst promoted teams that I've seen in years. I think people were saying Leicester City and Southampton were pretty much on track for having some of the worst Premier League campaigns they've seen in a few seasons now. So we lost to 2 relegated teams, not far apart from each other. I think the Leicester City game was in early January, and then I think the November fixture against Ipswich Town was like November 10th or something like that. So, I mean, they weren't even that far apart from each other. So for me, those were the worst moments of the season. My other contender was being 6-1 down, to Liverpool at home. But the way I look at it, Liverpool were a pretty exceptional team, and we kind of got stomped by them multiple times. So maybe we just, we're never meant to beat them or never meant to give them a good game anyways.
Ironically, when you actually look at mine and your picks signal relegation fodder, and my picks, considering how far we were off them,
I see your point now.
making us look like relegation fodder. So
I see the point you made earlier. Yeah,
but,
they're like different fixtures, but similar reasons. Like
yeah, exactly. But we must highlight the best moment, which alleviates a lot of the pain, if not all the pain from last season, was the Europa League win, and then the trophy parade that followed.
100%.
Look, I'm not gonna lie, I'm still on a high from that. I still sit there every once in a while, veer towards back then memories, and often wonder will I see them again. But that's definitely the best moment, guys. And ultimately, that's what we're in the game for, which is glory.
Like I said, I'll be happy clapping for a year straight. Also goes without mentioning, flop of the season could easily be given to Timo Werner, but I think that was also one of the ones that was just kind of, we wanted to think a little bit harder about it at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But thank you everybody for watching back this video. Thank you for supporting the channel. Thank you to all the members supporting us throughout the summer and throughout the season campaigns. You guys' support really does help us out a ton. Love you all. And we'll see you for the next video. Come on, you Spurs. And let's hope for much better end of the season awards next year. Let's hope for much better ones. But then again, winning the Europa League kind of makes up for it all at the end of the day, like Dave said. See you next time, everybody.